I get into bats really. So yeah, and suggested it might be interesting just to start there, which I wasn't going to include in my talk, but yeah, just in case anybody's interested really, and hopefully it shows that anybody can get into wildlife and become interested. So I graduated uni in about 2003 from ecology degree, and went and worked out at Point of Air down on the dunes and the farmland behind, managing habitats for dune systems, but also for wetland birds. And at the same time as doing that, I began to get interested in bats and joined the local bat group. And from there, it snowballed really, from kind of a hobby into an obsession. And so I think I've been kind of working with bats now for 20 years. And once I left Talacra, I ran an independent consultancy for 12 years, specializing in bats and mitigation and conservation. And then about 5 years ago, I switched to NRW, to Natural Resources Wales, where I am specialist advisor for terrestrial mammals. And through the time that I've been interested in bats, it's been quite amazing, really. It's taken me to lots of places, done lots of things. I've travelled all around the world. So lots of the pictures that you'll see in my talk are my photographs from lots of different places around the country, but also around Europe and tropics and Southeast Asia and lots of different places that I've been to look at them. They take you into quite amazing places that you wouldn't normally get to kind of look in, to be honest. So you get invited into weird, wonderful structures. Every year I go and explore German World War II bunkers in Poland. I kind of, just old like old buildings, mansions, places that normally you'd never get to go and look in. I get invited in to poke around and look for bats, so it's really cool. I sit on all sorts of different steering bodies. So for UK Mammals and UK bat steering groups, I work with Eurobats as a UN convention protection of species. So have European counterparts. So yeah, you get to know a lot of really cool, weird people. But yeah, and get to go into lots of really cool places. And yeah, bats are just amazing animals. So I'll start. I'll just
Do you want
try
to
and
get
share
that,
my screen.
ready for you? You can get that up on the screen and we'll start the talk properly, and I'll get my face off as well.
Hopefully. Just let me know when you can see that.
I can see, yeah, you can see it.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Okay.
So yeah,
so
yeah, I can see that. I'm going to get off now. So just to let you all know, the chat box is open. So if you've got any questions for Sam throughout, please write it in the chat box, and then we'll go through those at the end. And if there's something which is really pressing and relevant, I will call out to Sam during the presentation, but we'll try and keep them all to the end to keep it nice and flowing for you. But thanks for that background, Sam. That was really, really interesting, because I met you, we'd hardly seen each other since sixth form, since school, since we went separate ways when you went off to university and I did my own things. And I met you again. You were dissecting owl pellets at RSPB Conway, weren't you, about 4 years ago? And it was just really interesting hearing that story of where it's come from and how you got into it. And it's just how you're kind of the life's unfolded from at school. And like you said, just by having an interest is how you kind of got into this specialist field, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Right, well, I'm going to turn myself off now, mate, and I'll let you get on with the talk. All right.
Okay, lovely. I was just going to say as well on that, there's lots of voluntary opportunities to get involved either with bat groups or local mammal groups. So yeah, there's plenty of chance for everybody to get involved with bats. So I'm going to start my talk with this slide. One of the reasons bats are quite so fascinating, and why I find them quite so interesting, is that they're incredibly diverse. So we've got 6,500 mammal species in Britain. Sorry, in Britain, that'd be quite impressive. In the world, and of those, about 1,400 are bats. So they're incredibly diverse. That's over a fifth of all mammal species are bats, and they range in terms of diversity depending where we are in the world. So around the tropics, you can see here that in Africa, there's around 200 species, Asia, 300 species, Central South America, 300 species. And up with us, we've only got about 17. But there's reasons for that, which I'll come on to. essentially in the tropics, there are less kind of, it's a lot easier life. You've got a lot more food resources that you can exploit. You've got year-round food resources, so flowers and plants and insects. You don't have seasons, so bats don't have to hibernate. So in our climes, bats have to hibernate to get over the cold winters. But as you can see from this map, bats stretch right up into the Arctic Circle and right down to southern South America. So on every continent apart from Antarctica. So they're incredibly successful and incredibly diverse. One of the reasons for this diversity is simply the amount of time that they have been evolving for. So this is a fossilized bat found in America, and this bat's about 50 million years old. And what we can see from this is that actually this bat is very, very similar to modern day bats. You can recognize the same structures in it. So what that means is that bats have been evolving for an incredibly long time. To get to the point 50 million years ago where they already looked like modern bats means that they probably started evolving about 180 million years ago. And they'd have probably come from an arboreal shrew type creature that would have jumped from branch to branch, chasing insects and looking for food, and then gradually started to glide, flying squirrels, and then progressed into kind of evolving in wings as we recognize them today. So with that huge amount of time that's passed, what we've ended up with is an incredibly diverse range of species. And what that means is that they look weird and wonderful. So these are some bats from the tropics. These old world flying foxes down the bottom left. These are this is an Australian species here. Yeah, so they look incredibly different. So morphologically, they've evolved to be incredibly different. With different adaptations to where they live and what they eat. So this bottom right one here, this is a fisherman bat, and you can see his great big long legs, which it's evolved to be able to trawl through water for fish. And the top left one there, more mops. This is you can see incredible facial adaptations, and in fact, many bats have facial adaptations, just like the one on the top right there. And this is all to do with their echolocation and the way that they call and the way that they receive those echoes, so their ears and kind of facial structures that can focus sound. And as well, it's looking very different. They've evolved to eat lots of different things. So we've got bats that eat pollen, bats that eat frogs, are carnivorous. So they'll kind of take any small mammals or fish, as you said, down the bottom right. Pollen, nectar. And of course, the top right one is the kind of one that everyone probably knows. This is a vampire bat. There's 3 different species of vampire bat that have evolved to eat blood. So yeah, so incredibly diverse what they do. All bats, sorry, we're going the wrong way. All bats in this country are insectivorous. So yeah, no vampires in this country. So as well as what they eat, what they look like, they also roost in lots of different places. So this top right one, top left is a bat from Japan, and that hibernates literally by just crawling into and sitting in snow. So they don't even really find a roost at all. They just lower their temperatures by sitting in snow. And these are only relatively recently discovered that they're actually doing this. Top right is a sucker-footed Spix's sucker-footed bat, and you can see that where it actually is you can see in the picture below being pointed at. This is a rolled helicalonian leaf, and the bats go into these and use these as roosts, and they have these little sucker foot, which is actually what their thumb have evolved into, a little sucker. So they can climb up and down these shiny leaves, and in these you can go through tropical areas, Central South America, and you look down into these cones, and you can find, obviously not everyone, but you can find bats roosting in long lines going down. The colonies kind of roost in lines down the thing. So there's a bed pointing to a leaf where there's a roost within there. And similarly, in other places they use leaves. So these are tent making bats on the bottom left here, and these chew through the stems of leaves to bend them over and make tents in certain ways, and you can identify them from a distance. When you look through the jungle, you can see leaves and how they're bent and how they're shaped, and different species bend them and bite them in different places to create different shaped tents. So they create their own roosts. And some bats don't even bother with roosts. So these are proboscis bats on the right hand side, because of their, you can see their elongated nose. And these are so well camouflaged that they just hang out in long lines over trees or structures that lean out over water bodies. Obviously it's taken, this photo took from the side, so you can see them sticking out, but when you look straight onto them, they're really hard to see. They're just naturally well camouflaged. And this is a bat on the left, this Chinese species that actually goes into bamboo and has an interesting relationship with a beetle who bores the holes to allow it into the bamboo. So bats have evolved two things really that stand them apart from all other mammals, and give them advantages in the ability to occupy niches that other animals can't, particularly when we're thinking about UK species. So as I said, they're all insectivorous, but bats have evolved two things. One is flight, and the other is echolocation. And what that does is it allows them to occupy the nighttime sky. And nothing else can really hunt insects at that time, so they get the kind of all the insects to themselves, and they find that, and there's a reduced level of predation. So owls are about the only thing that can naturally predate on bats. So all the daytime hawks and what have you can't hunt them. Their biggest problem actually is cats, to be honest. But so to evolve flight, as you can see from this picture, you can see that their body structure, they are mammals. They have kind of, these are essentially their arms. So here we've got the forearm, elbow, and upper arm, and the ends of the wings are basically their fingers. So you get a little thumb that they can grip on with, a little short thumb with a short claw on it, and the other four fingers are greatly elongated and have a membrane between them, creating the wing. And they also have a short tail. Most species don't have a free tail, but some do. But this membrane attaches onto that tail, and then basically, that membrane, the evolution of the wings allow them to fly. And then the second thing, echolocation. Echolocation is essentially shouting really, really loudly. They shout so loudly that they deafen themselves. So when they shout, they have to close a little muscle in their ears before they shout. So they close their ears, shout, and then open their ears, wait for the echo to come back, analyze that call, close their ears, shout, and they do that in fractions of a second for each call. It's an incredibly rapid process, and they can build up incredibly accurate and detailed pictures of their surroundings depending on how they produce their call. So they're basically just waiting for echoes, so they can tell direction of insects depending on how it goes, what they can tell what's surrounding them, build up a really incomplete pitch blackness, can fly in incredibly complex and cluttered environments. So bats in Britain, we have about 17 species along the south coast, and up in Scotland, there's only about 4. So even as I showed before, between the tropics and heading north up to Britain, you've got 17 compared to 300 further south. Even within Britain, we find a reduction in diversity of bat species as you head north, and this is mainly climate related, although we will start to see more species heading north as climate change occurs, and we've got lots of models kind of predicting what's going to happen in terms of different species moving. And some of this we're already seeing now, things like with the movement of greater horseshoes into North Wales. So yeah, we do have a separation in numbers of species depending where you are, and our species have quite defined distributions. As I said before, one of the main reasons for a reduction in number of species here is the fact that we are a temperate climate. So in theory, in summer, we have nice hot summers, we have nice cold winters. Normally it's a bit wet in the summer and a bit wet in winter, but we still do have seasonal separation. And so bats have evolved to hibernate, which they don't have to do in tropics. But that does take a definite toll on their body. It dictates their life cycles and their breeding cycles, and what food they can have, when really the response to the weather is a response to what food is available. So when there's poor weather, there are less insects about, basically. So as we go into winter, a lot less insects, and so bats have to hibernate to save food resources to get through the winter. So this image is just really showing you how bats behave in the UK in temperate areas through the winter. So right now, might as well start where we are. We're in December. Bats are underground, well, bats are hibernating, and they can hibernate in lots of different places, but the classic kind of places in cellars, in underground structures, caves, mines, quarries. What they're really looking for is cool, stable conditions where they can achieve torpor. So if temperature fluctuates lots, it's not good for them. If it's too dry, it's not good for them. Bats need to stay hydrated, and humid conditions help them stay in torpor for longer. So moving out of December, we're moving up into January, still hibernating, and they're using up a lot of their energy reserves, through to February, where they very little fat left, and then beginning to start to become active in March. To say that they just go under into hibernation and don't come out would be wrong. Lots of species are still active on warmer evenings. They have to respond, and they're very good at knowing. Even bats that are deep down in underground systems will know when there's a good weather and when it's worth going out. So because for bats, it's a very fine line between survival or not. They have to, they only forage when there's enough insects about to gain the energy that they would do by flying. So obviously flying expends a lot of energy. If they're not going to catch insects, they don't fly. But when the weather's better, and especially when they're hungry, they will try and hunt even in the winter. So then, through into March, they'll start coming out more and more and more. In April, they're coming out, they're hungry, they're feeding hard, trying to regain some of the body condition and fat that they've lost over the winter. As they move into May, they begin to search out for their summer roosts. And so when we think about bats and their roosts, a lot of people have an image of lots of bats pouring out of a building or out of a structure. Now, where we get large congregations of bats in this country is predominantly through maternity roosts. So in May and June, May, they're looking for their maternity roosts, and this is where the females gather together. So for most species, it's predominantly female, where they gather together to have their young. And this has got lots of advantages by doing this. So bats can control their energy consumption and their birth date of their offspring. So when the weather's bad, females can, if roost on cold side of buildings, and they'll roost separately, and that will lower their body temperatures, and it will reduce the rate of growth of their embryo. Because again, going back to they've got to have enough insects, enough food when they have their young, when they have their pups, and they only have one pup a year. They've got to have enough energy to raise that pup, and it's very hard. So they need to be able to time when they have their young. So by roosting on the cold side of a building separately, they can reduce their temperature, slow down that birth date. Opposite, if it's lovely warm weather, lots of insects about, they want to have their young, because lactation is a very energetically demanding time on a female bat. They want to get that pup out and start feeding and producing that milk. So if the weather's warm, they'll cluster together and move to the warm side of the building to increase that, to bring that birth date forward, so that they can hopefully have a greater chance of successfully rearing young. And of course, weather changes very rapidly, and so unfortunately, if we get bad spells of weather after pups are born, normally gestation's about 4 to 5 weeks, and within 4 or 5 weeks, those pups that are born are volants. They're flying themselves and able to search out food for themselves. But in between those periods, if the weather is simply too bad, bats will abandon their young, or they'll abort their fetus, because it's more important, if you only have one pup a year, it's more important to survive to the next year to have another one. So bats are very long lived. We've got some of the oldest rung bats are well into their 40s now. So very different life strategy they take to rodents, for example. So, a lot of people think, oh, they're just with wings, aren't they? But no, very, very different, very evolutionary distinct, and completely different life strategy. So rodents live fast, die young. They only live for a couple of years. They have lots of young in each litter and lots of litters each year. While as bats will live for a long time, and they'll only have one puppy, sometimes twins, but generally, only one pup a year. And it's more important for them to survive to the next year, to have another pup the next year, because they've always got kind of more years in them than killing themselves. So, if they just try and rear that young, regardless of how much insects and energy are about, they could actually impact their own survival. So they do have ways of kind of managing that. So then, moving into June, when the young are born, they'll be volant within about 4 or 5 weeks. So by really partway through July into August, again, it all depends on the season, all depends on the weather. But by July, the young are nearly full sized and starting to forage on their own. In August, our maternity roosts begin to break up. So particularly for some species that can congregate into larger numbers, and often in small spaces, it can become quite basically they end up with parasite loads and lots of droppings within the roost. So then they'll move out as soon as they can, really, and desert the nursery roosts and separate into the fragmented roosts. And they've got lots of different roost statuses, which we'll talk about in a bit, that they can move on to use. And then in September, this was the important point, really, about they're saying about when bats choose to have their young. So the ability of the female to choose when she becomes pregnant allows her to then dictate when the pup will be born, and that can be done on based on how good the weather is. And so the ability to choose when to impregnate themselves is incredibly powerful tool for them. So in September, mating takes place. So they mate in the autumn, and they'll store the sperm over the winter, and so the female can choose in the spring whether she's going to have a pup or when to have that pup. And so mating is quite amazing. Different systems within bats, even within the species that we have in Britain, we've got lots of different types of mating systems. One of the ones that we're doing a lot of work on studying at the moment is called swarming, autumn swarming. So bats go to hibernation sites in the middle of the night, about 4 hours after sunset, and they gather together in large numbers and fly in and out of the entrance in a kind of chasing each other, social interaction. And we're still trying to really understand exactly what's going on with this, but essentially what we think it is, there's a mix of mating, there's a mix of showing young bats where the hibernation sites are, information exchange, and general kind of social interaction. And for a long time we didn't really know that this was happening, because it happens about 4 hours after sunset. So normally as a bat worker, you go out and you watch bats come out of the building, and you might follow them for a bit, and then you go home or you sleep for a few hours, and then you see the bats coming back to the roost in the morning, just before dawn. But what we didn't do was certainly go to hibernation sites in the summer, or in the autumn, in the middle of the night. So for a long time, it kind of went unnoticed that this was happening. But over the last kind of 10 years, we've been studying this quite a lot. Yeah, so bats are gathering, and it can be viewed as a kind of ritual mating site. These swarming sites. So some of the work that's been done on it has put rings on bats, and we found that bats are coming from up to 60 kilometers away to these sites, and they're not going to other ones. They're very specifically coming to a swarming site. So even where we've got sites side by side by side, they still go to very specific ones. So ritual mating sites. So it's really important that we actually protect those. Other species have like lekking behavior, or form harems. So a male will sit in a hole in a tree, for example, and he'll sing, and he'll do little song flights, launch out, fly backwards and forwards in and out of his hole, and singing. So not echolocation calls, but they have a very kind of complex social structure, and complex social calls. So the males can sing, and he'll bring in a number of females. So within pipistrelles, that might be 15 or 20 females. They'll stay together around for a week and mate, and then disperse. In other species, we see these like lekking. So that's a number of males that sit round, in different locations, and they'll all call, and then the female makes the decision which male she thinks is the fittest. So yeah, the whole mating systems, again, we're really only beginning to understand it. And to me, these questions, and I'm sure people will ask questions that hopefully I won't know the answer to. And that's why bats are quite so fascinating, because we're still figuring out an awful lot of stuff. There's a real secret world, and we're beginning to understand more and more as equipment gets better, and more and more research is done. But there's still big question marks about how exactly what behaviors of bats. Makes them really interesting to study. So yeah, then moving into October, the weather begins to decline. Bats are building up fat, ready for winter, and start to go into torpor. So when the weather's poorer, and moving into November, weather poorer, they'll shut down into torpor, but they're still able to come in and out more before they go into kind of more true hibernation, probably into December. But again, it's all relative to the weather outside at the time. So as I was saying, there's lots of different types of roosts. Some maternity ones, where the females gather together. These are of high conservation significance. If bats can't breed, then our populations are at risk. As I said before, it's the females gathering together, and it's all about the energy and the warmth that they can gain, and how they save energy, or how they expend it. And how they can control their birth dates. And some species in Britain, such as pipistrelles, in Scotland, we got roosts of up to 4,000 bats. Some of the largest ones in North Wales, there's a couple of thousand, between 1.5 and 2,000 in one or two sites for pipistrelles. But a lot of the time, it's generally in the hundreds for pips. But some species, it's only tens, so they do gather together, but in quite or can be in lower numbers. We've got a whole range of different classifications of roosts as well, beyond maternity roost. So males tend to roost separately or in small numbers with non-breeding females. So just a handful may gather together, but often just singularly. And these are day roosts, non-breeding roosts, night roosts, and generally they're considered to be slightly lower conservation significance, although importantly equally protected. So one the roost of a single common species is legally as protected as a roost of 100 maternity roost of 100 very rare bats. The law doesn't distinguish between numbers or species. But generally, when we're dealing with them, we do tend to think that they're a lower conservation significance, although not inconsequential in terms of conservation. So night roosts have always been thought of as probably not that important. So a night roost is a bat will say, for example, come out of a maternity roost and it will go off to a woodland and it will forage for an hour, say, and then it's got a tummy full of insects, so it needs to digest and preen and have a rest. But if it flies all the way back to its maternity roost, it's going to spend a lot of the energy that it's just worked hard to feed. So what they have is night roosts, kind of staging posts, and these can be within trees or like old outhouses or anywhere, somewhere it's just sheltered that they can go and hang up. And in there, they'll preen and digest and socialize. Other bats will come in and go out again. So kind of like staging outposts away from their normal roost. And so they were always thought, oh, it's only a night roost, but actually more and more research has been done to say that these are really, really important for the way that bats use our landscape and their ability to survive, because of these energetic reasons. And yeah, as it says there, males mostly roost away from females in cooler places. And in Britain, we can find these roosts in all kinds of different structures. Often we'll think about an old stately home or an old barn as being a good place for bats, which it most definitely is. But equally, bats can use new buildings, estates, where if there's the potential within a building for bats to get in, then they will. They'll utilize it. Particularly depending on what the surrounding habitat is often a big consideration as well. But generally, old buildings do let more bats in simply because they're in. There's more gaps and crevices and places for them to get into. And similarly with trees, we think about old ancient trees with lots of features in ancient broadleaves to be really, really good for bat roosts, which they are. But equally, what we're finding now is really surprisingly small trees with limited features are really important roosts as well. So you can see the lady's found one on the right hand side, which is just a low down wound on a relatively young tree, and in there was some particularly rare bats. So you can't really rule them out. So the more we look at bats, the more we realize they're kind of everywhere, using lots of different features, lots of different sites, and that makes it quite challenging sometimes to try and protect them. And particularly, because they're using these different types of roosts all through the year. So, the mating roost, which I was talking about before, but also hibernation sites, which can be in old bridges, in cliffs, in old quarries, obviously our kind of caves and mines, which North Wales has huge numbers of, as well as trees, again, in the winter as well, in young trees and old trees. But bats have done very well. So as I was saying before, how long bats have been evolving for. Often when we get long evolved species, and humans have come along in the blink of an evolutionary eye and massively changed our planet. And for a lot of species that are very long evolved, that's quite a challenge. To adapt to the rapid changes that humans have caused. Bats, however, have done incredibly well. In fact, there's some species now that we predominantly associate with built structures more than what they used to use. So, for example, lesser horseshoe bats we think about in big old stately homes or big buildings in roof voids. There are roof void dwelling species. Of course, that's only since humans have come along and built buildings, so actually they've evolved very well and switched and adapted very well in a short space of time, and a lot of species don't manage to do that to their detriment. So yeah, bats have quite amazingly adapted and use a huge range of structures, everything that we build, even now we're just learning more and more about them, even in modern motorway box culverts they're using to hibernate in, as much as old mines, as much as where they would originally have hibernated within caves and in trees. So yeah, very adaptable, and we find that hibernation roosts in all kinds of different places. We don't tend to find them in large congregations, apart from when it comes to horseshoes in this country. Often it would be ones and twos in different sites for all the other Vespa bats, but they all have similar features that they're looking for. And that is that they're cool, stable temperatures with high humidity. Hibernation sites, as well as you say, are really vulnerable to disturbance. So sometimes you'll be out and about and you might see a cave or a mine with a grill on it. And these were often grilled to stop disturbance of people kind of casually going in. Often people like to go and have fires and camp out in mouths of caves. And these can be highly detrimental. So, again, it's all back to this energy balance. And if they wake up during hibernation when they're not intending to, and the food's not around, they'll use up a chunk of their fat reserves, and it can be the difference between, if they get regularly woken by disturbance, it can be the difference between making it through the winter, surviving, and not. So yeah, really vulnerable to disturbance during hibernation. So yeah, all our bats in Britain are protected under European and UK legislation. We've got 17 species of bats in Britain, and so kind of moving back into Wales a bit more, we've got 15 species of those 17 that are recorded in Wales. Some of them really rare, some of them very common. And of those 15 recorded, 14 are confirmed to be breeding. So we always get the odd ones that kind of move in, or that we know are here. And you get vagrants and migrants and occasional occurrences. But we've got 14 that are confirmed breeding populations in Wales. So we're just trying to put this, just before we were talking, we're just trying to put this chart together of really how we split our bats. So we've got two families of bats in the UK. We've got our horseshoe bats and Vespa bats. So Vespa bats, what's known as evening bats, and they're basically everything else apart from the lesser horseshoe and greater horseshoe. Which you probably hear a lot of people talking about horseshoes in Wales. So horseshoes are very geographically restricted to, and Wales is one of their strongholds. They're very much a kind of Western Britain. Don't go further north than North Wales, really. Virtually not at all. But yeah, Wales is a stronghold. We hold about 61% of the UK lesser horseshoe population in Wales, so we're a real stronghold. Devon and Cornwall as well for greater and lesser, really important areas. And so yeah, and then within those we've got our long-eared bats. We've got brown and grey long-eared. Grey are very rare and restricted predominantly to the south coast of Britain, in Devon area, really. And we do have one record for Wales, and it was a very occurrence in Pembrokeshire where somebody sent off DNA droppings, so a DNA test of droppings in a roost, and it came back as grey long-eared. So it must have been quite a lost individual come across the water from Devon, to be honest. But it was never found again, and a lot of work was put in looking for it. But yeah, we don't think it's actually here. Just occurred once. The pipistrelles are our commonest species. You'll hear a lot of people talk about, if they're looking for bats. If you see a bat flying around in your garden in the evening, it's 9 times out of 10 going to be a pipistrelle. Pipistrelles come out early in the evening. They don't mind light. Some species absolutely hate light. Other species don't mind it so much, and will even take advantage of it. So ones that don't mind it will come out earlier. A lot of the other species will come out after it's too dark to really see them or know what's happening. So 9 times out of 10, when people say, "Oh yeah, I've got bats that come and visit the garden," it'll be a common or soprano pipistrelle. And then we've got a third species of pipistrelle that probably occurs more often. I always used to say it's a rare migratory bat. And it's one of those things where now we've started looking for it. It's actually not quite as rare as we thought it was before. We're finding it more and more and more. It's predominantly associated with water bodies, large water bodies, as through Britain. There are resident populations in Ireland, quite large ones, but very few in the UK that we know of. But they visit overwinter very regularly. Most of them summer roost in Latvia, Russia, northern Eastern Europe, and then migrate several thousand kilometers across Europe in huge numbers. It's probably the biggest mammal migration in Europe. If you could actually see it happening, it would be very large numbers of bats pouring down the coast of mainland Europe, and then going down into France, Spain, and beyond, and into the UK as well, and crossing over the sea. So yeah, quite an amazing species. We haven't found them breeding yet, but we regularly find them now in Wales, but we've still not to establish that they're breeding. That's why I put them in yellow in this chart. Next, we've got the Myotis. So you'll often hear these. They're very difficult species to tell apart. They look very similar, and there's quite a few of them. Whiskered Branson, Natras, Dorbentons, Bechsteins, and then Alcathoe down in red. It's a relatively new species to science, and it's very cryptic with the whiskered and brant, so it's quite hard to tell apart. So we think it's probably more widespread, but they're difficult to tell apart. And often we're really only able to tell by looking at very small morphological differences. The shape of the inner ear, the tragus, their dentition. So we look for a tiny little cusp on one of the premolars, and it's a relative length between them, and between whiskered and brant, it's equally hard to tell. And also penis shape as well. So if it's male, you've got a third clue. If it's a female, you've only got 2 clues to try and base your main kind of ID features on. Barbastelle is a rare woodland bat, and there's only one of those, the western Barbastelle. And then we have our big bats. So Nyctalus, these are noctule and lizards, so they're big, high-flying bats, predominantly woodland bats, roost in trees. And then Epseticus alceritine, just one of those in this country. Now you'll notice here that the two families are very, I've set them apart here, and that's because although they both live in Britain, we used to think that they're relatively closely related. But what genetic works actually showed us is that they're massively evolutionary different. They diverged a very long time ago, to the point where our horseshoe bats in this country are closer related to the flying foxes of Australia than they are to the Vespa bats. So incredibly different. And if we get time, I'll talk about them a little bit more later, because they really are a kind of North Wales speciality, as it were. We've got such a lot of them, and they're kind of really fascinating species that we put a lot of work into the conservation of them because they were so rare. But yeah, so 14 species of bats. To those, as very about, were widespread, and 6 have restricted distributions. And of these rare bats, 5 of them rely on woodlands. So woodlands is an incredibly important habitat for Britain. Virtually all species of bat, in fact, I don't think there's a single bat that doesn't use woodland, roost in woodland, or forage in woodland at some point, and some of them are completely dependent on woodlands for the entire time. So yes, these 6 at the bottom are our rarer bats, and as you can see, they are restricted in their distribution across the UK, but also within Wales. So when I was putting this talk together originally, it's talk I've given a couple of times, to be honest, but I'll kind of change it a little bit each time and add a bit more in. But when I originally wrote it, I was writing it as Bats of Snowdonia, not North Wales, and I wanted to say why were Snowdonia bat populations quite so good, and I put Snowdonia into Google Images, and this was the first image, number 1 image that came up, and I was like, well, that's it in a nutshell. This is why bats, North Wales and Snowdonia in this instance are so good for bats. This image really shows all the different habitat types that bats need. So you've got water, you've got wet meadows, you've got lots of woodland, you've got mountains with caves and mines in, you've got old houses, you've got hedgerows. You've basically got everything bat needs here. Not intensely farmed. Bats are pretty simple animals. They need somewhere to roost, and something to eat, basically. And with that, so within in North Wales, lots of old buildings suitable with lots of kind of holes and gaps and crevices. Should say before, bats don't create holes. They simply take advantage of what's there. So they won't, like rats, for example, dig out or chew a hole in something. They'll just, if there's a hole there, they'll be able to gain access to it and use it, but they won't damage the fabric of a building by trying to get in. But yeah, they need somewhere to build, so lots of old barns and old buildings, place them to get into, and then a wide range of habitat types, a mosaic of habitats to be able to forage and commute through the landscape in between their roosting sites and their foraging areas. So yeah, you can, the type of landscape that we have in North Wales lends itself to bats. And again, within Snowdonia and a lot of other counties are working towards it now, really, is this Dark Sky Association accreditation. So Snowdonia has achieved it, and there's other counties are working on it now within North Wales to reduce the levels of light, and that also really helps with bats. So as I said before, some species don't mind light and they'll take advantage of it. So the early emerging species such as pipistrelles and serotine and noctules, they're not too worried about light. It's the point where, if you see a street light in the evening, in a warm evening, you'll quite often see bats flying around that street light, and those are often pipistrelles. If they're small bats, they're pipistrelles that are taking advantage of the insects that are drawn to the light. And other species really don't like it at all. So they'll stay away from it. And the problem with lots of lighting is those species that don't mind it do quite well, because it's almost they're drawn to light, so then they can fly around the lights and forage. But if you're a species that doesn't like light and you want to avoid it, if you've got too much lighting, it will draw the insects away from your natural foraging grounds and leave you with less food. So it impacts your commuting, it impacts your foraging, and it impacts your survival with too much lighting. So again, dark skies are very good for bats. In fact, to the point where if anybody's ever driven along the A487, I think it is, that runs behind Glenclevon, you'll see there are low-level bollards lighting the edges of the road at various points. These aren't for lighting the road. These are actually to discourage lesser horseshoes that roost in Glenclevon from crossing the road. It turns them round, basically, or drives them up and over the lighting, because they don't like it, so they'll avoid it, and then hopefully avoid being hit by cars at certain times of the year. So lighting is really important for bats. So there's lots of different groups we work with to try and understand and study the bats of Wales, and figure out what species are here and what the populations are doing. So we've got two different bat groups, the Gwynedd bat group and the Clwyd bat group. These were both formed in the mid-80s. So they've been working hard for a long time to understand where populations are, and where roosts are, and to monitor those populations. And the mammal group as well. So we did have Snowdonia mammal group, which morphed into the North Wales mammal group, working with CCW, whoever they were before that, NCC, and then now Natural Resources Wales, conjunction with the JNCC and Bat Conservation Trust. The Bat Conservation Trust is our national charity for bat conservation, and all these groups work together to form, to gather as much information as possible, which informs us of the state of our UK bat populations in terms of figuring out populations and mainly trends, really, from this monitoring. So how do we do it? Well, we find roosts, we search out roosts, so we can do that via acoustic surveys, listening to their echolocation calls, and lots of bats will have quite distinctive calls. Some of them there's a lot of crossover and it's hard to tell them apart, but just as with birds, you can tell songs apart, you can do similar things with bats and their calls, and some are very distinctive and some are hard to tell. So we do a lot of time, a lot of recording at night, listening to their calls. Lots of tree surveys, looking for bats in trees. We do a lot of caving, mining, searching out bats underground during the winter. And in the summer, we stand outside buildings and wait for them to fly out so we can count the numbers, particularly on known roosts. This gives us good trends. And for different species as well, we'll go out and try and catch them when we think that there's a good reason. If we think that there's rare species there or cryptic species from the calls, then we can go out and we can play this little device on what is called a harp trap. So you can see lots of strings. It's fishing wire essentially strung up in this frame with a catch bag at the bottom, and it's a completely harmless way of catching bats. We can miss net like you do with birds as well. There's a slight more risk with mist netting that bats occasionally injure themselves within mist nets, and but these harp traps are very good at safely arresting flight. They float down into the bag, and they can't climb back out of this bag. It's coated with plastic, and it's got kind of leaves, kind of envelopes within it that the bats kind of just line up in. And then what we can do is play social calls. So this is a little lure speaker, and the lure plays out synthesized social calls out into the environs, which draw bats in to investigate what's going on, and then hopefully they go into our trap. We've got camera systems in various different roosts. So this was one that was just being trialed. So we don't just fitted this into a site in Conway Valley. So already a couple of bats have turned up, but we can get good coverage of numbers depending on the site and the system, but also behavioral interactions as well, which is always nice. And as I said before, we do a lot of training on recording of echolocation calls. So this was a workshop that we ran a few years ago now, inviting people to come and learn how to identify bats from their calls. And again, yeah, that's of catching when we've done looked at those calls and we identify something that could be something interesting or that we're not sure what is, or a woodland, for example, has a high number of unidentified bats via calls, and we can go out and try and catch and pin those down to what they are in the hand. And when we do that, we take lots of different measurements from the bats, try and understand their ecology a bit better and build into national data sets for weights and sizes. Across North Wales, we've got a number of bat box schemes, so we can go out and monitor these bat boxes to see what species are in there and what numbers, and we can do this on regular rotation. So again, it helps us understand the health of woodlands. Bats are an indicator of biodiversity and healthy ecosystems. So by monitoring the bats in a woodland, you can get a feel for the actual general health of a woodland as well. So bat boxes are a good way of doing that. These were, we can do our transects in different ways, use different equipment. This is a slide from old slide. This is basically really old kit now, to be honest, but used to give us good calls and we'd be able to GPS it. So this chunk of plastic at the front is a GPS. So whenever you drive anywhere, you could stick it out your window and record all the species that you'd hear on the way. These days, our equipment's a lot better. You can see we've got built-in screens. These are all internal GPS plotted where the bats are and where time, location. So then we can map our stuff very easily, and our software is developed massively, so we get a much better look. And it's also a lot smaller. So me with a microphone on my head, so I could go looking through quarries on my bike to try and search out how bats were using quarries at the time. So you can kind of adapt the equipment in a lot of different ways to build up records. And then this is, what it all builds towards is actually our distribution maps. And this is for common pipistrelle. And what's interesting here is actually just how many gaps there, in theory, shouldn't actually be a gap in this map. There's not really a square that common pipistrelle won't be occurring in North Wales. So really for common species, these maps end up being a bit of a map of effort rather than actual distribution. So there's just not much. So often our records developed are also found through developments and through people doing commercial surveys as well as voluntary work. So you can see obviously within our big mountain lands, there's not much development, so not so many records are collected, and not so many people live, so people aren't recording in a voluntary way on their own patch and uplands. But yeah, and then so if you're interested in understanding the distribution of our species a little bit more in North Wales, you can go to the North Wales Mammal Group website and click on Mammal Atlas. And you can type any species into the right hand side, and this is all powered by Covnod, and it will give you an up-to-date kind of a distribution map of records. So you can see, you can zoom in on where you live and see exactly what bats are around you. So if you live in Betis, so zoom in there and you can check what records there are and what species there are, and it's quite nice to know what's on your doorstep. And so I was just going to go focus in on a couple of things, that the projects that we've worked on, and more intense studies. Just having a look at time's going okay. So one thing you can mention is I was asked to do this talk originally by Jordan Hurst, who's based over in Northeast. So I was trying to give it a bit of a Northeast slant. I know I spoke about Snowdonia before, but I was thinking about our populations in Northeast, and it would be nice to talk a little bit about the work of Clwyd Bat Group. So the Bat Group formed in mid-80s as a response really to the Wildlife and Countryside Act, where bats were originally protected following campaign work undertaken by a guy called Bob Stebbings pre-Wildlife and Countryside Act. There was only a handful of people who studied bats and were interested in bats, and one of the main guys was Bob Stebbings, and he recognized that bats were undergoing decline during his lifetime of studies of them. And so he campaigned for them to be included on Wildlife and Countryside Act, and they were protected. And then all of a sudden, bats had were protected, and we realised that actually nobody really knows much about bats apart from these handful of people, where they are, what they need, and certainly on a local level. So following that, in the mid 80s, bat groups were set up around the country to try and look at local bat populations, and Clwyd Bat Group and Gwynedd Bat Group were no different. They set up then. So Clwyd based a lot of their work on, we had this original a study that you can see on the left, which was John Blow, who studied bats between 60 and 67 and did some ringing within North Wales, but a lot of sites within Denbighshire and Flintshire. And so we took that information, looked at sites, and then the Bat Group went out and looked at all the sites that they could think of that might be used by bats to hibernate in. And in 87, this report was published on the numbers of bats that they'd found. And you can see some of the maps of the sites that were surveyed. As you can see, a lot of it here, if you know Clwyd and geology of Clwyd, these are limestone areas, so you end up with lots of caves, natural caves within limestone, so these are all monitored, but then also these outlined dots are caves and mines. If we were over in Gwynedd, it would be a bit of a different, most of it's caves and mines rather than natural caves. There's not many natural caves at all in north west Wales. And a few of you might recognise this guy, Kipper Davis. He's one of our kind of leading guys in Clwyd Bat Group. He was there from the start, and still he's current and incredible knowledge of bats in well bats in general, but certainly in Clwyd as well. But yeah, so the group's been going a long time, and every winter we do summer monitoring of known roosts, but every winter we go caving and go into mines and count the bats, looking at the numbers. Some of them are easy walk-in sites, some of them are horrible little crawls, and some of them are big abseils into kind of complex underground systems. But essentially it all revolves around looking into crevices, looking through, searching for bats, and lesser horseshoes are well counted and well monitored. They tend to roost out. They hang from the roof like Christmas baubles, while as most species, or the other Vespa bats, a lot of them will tuck themselves away into cracks and crevices. So it takes quite a lot of painstaking work to kind of inch your way through these underground systems, looking into all the cracks and crevices, trying to search out bats. And occasionally, this is about the biggest cluster that we've ever found in Clovis. We do find good numbers, but yeah, this is one of the biggest clusters that we have. Is designated triple SI for mixed bat assemblage, but normally it's just in ones and twos of the non-horseshoe species. And this picture on the right is yeah, kind of demonstrates just what high humidity they do like at times. So this bat's certainly not going to get dehydrated. So bats in hibernation will wake up about every 2 weeks ish to urinate and to drink. And obviously, if it's high humidity, they can literally urinate where they are and lick the condensation off themselves to get their drink. They don't even have to move. So high humidity, again, not only slows dehydration, but also gives them the ability to drink as well sometimes. So this is a little whiskered bat and barely recognizable with so much water on it, condensation. But all those years of monitoring bats, summer and winter, ended up with a lot of records. And a few years ago, we kind of tried to take all these paper-based records and old reports and notebooks and stick them into a big old spreadsheet. And this has really given us the ability to far more critically look into what our different sites are doing and the trends of different sites, and group our sites together. So these sites here are all geographically very close together, and we can look at where certain species are occurring. So these are sites where greater horseshoes are starting to occur in increasing numbers, but we can look at that over time and group together, so it's really useful. This is a site which we've just designated triple SI based on the work of the group, and it's quite a nice picture. So I should have updated this really. So it only goes up to 2015 when I put these slides together. But what you can see is that this Penarth slate mine, which is just outside Corwin, when it was first found in the early 90s, used to go up there. There was handfuls of lesser horseshoes, and you can see it slowly increased, but didn't do much. And then in 2007, the Mines Inspectorate closed the site. It used to be used a lot by outdoor centres and groups, and so in 2007, Mines Inspectorate said that the entrance wasn't safe anymore to take kids in there. And so it was closed, and at that point the disturbance reduced significantly, and then over the preceding years, so we've got data for every year, but I just pulled out some of them kind of every few years here, and you can see that the numbers go up and up. So peaking that it's now over 300 on the more recent counts, but you can see the trend here through the time and really kind of jumping 2007 when disturbance was stopped by the groups using it year round, and then this information is built towards designating the site as a triple SI for hibernating bats, and you can see we can draw out trends for other species as well on the local level. And then this is another site, a similar picture, not necessarily heavily disturbed, but really just kind of reflecting the general pattern of bats in North Wales. So one of the things we could see from all this work, looking at the data, was when the guys started going out in the mid 80s, they'd get really excited if there was a site with kind of bats in the tens, so less than 50 was a big number. Now we've got sites that are 400, and all these sites have kind of just gone up and up and up in terms of numbers. So for lesser horseshoe, at least, we've seen a really positive trend, and these numbers, what we do is feed them into the NBMP, which is a National Bat Monitoring Program. So although we can look at these locally, what we do is stick them into a national program as well, which builds on the national trends as well, which is really useful information. And here's just a picture of the site that we're just looking at the information for. This was from 1976 by I think it was by Paul Racy, who was one of the original kind of bat researchers in Scotland, and he actually came to North Wales to see lesser horseshoes in mid 70s. And took this picture, and this is a picture from a very similar position in about 2002, where you can see just a nice visual representation of just how populations and numbers are increasing at these sites. So all these counts started in or the first report in 87, and since then we found 82 hibernation sites. 42 of those have sufficient numbers, and we're able to count regularly enough to put into the National Bat Monitoring Programme, so we feed into national statistics. Over that time, and 2,282 surveys of the sites, and that's recorded a total of nearly 91,000 individual bats recorded, and now 83,000 of those were lesser horseshoe bat records, and all of this data has gone into COFNOD and every year goes into the National Bat Monitoring Programme. The National Bat Monitoring Programme is vital for the work certainly I do professionally in looking at trends and looking at populations of bats on a kind of national scale, but you can see, you know, that essentially we form trends of bats. This was the last State of the UK Bats as an annual report, when we do the next big update anytime now. But this was the last one, 2017, for the kind of bigger overview, longer term view, where we can see, you know, trends of positive and negative, and most species are either increasing, so we can see a clear trend with lesser horseshoe and greater horseshoe, which are very well monitored, and then, you know, for most other species we think that they're slowly increasing or stable. There is some decline noted, but generally for the species that are declining, it's often because the data is less reliable. So for other species, they're a lot harder to monitor. They move roosts quite regularly, so you can't count year on year on year. With greater and lesser horseshoes, they're very loyal to roosts, so they'll be there forever. But for like pipistrelles, they'll be there for 5 years and then build up in numbers, and then all of a sudden they'll disappear. They'll go to another roost, and then and you know, so you can't get that quite so much long-term continuity of data. But generally speaking, most species are slowly increasing or stable. And all this work also feeds into a kind of national overview. So this was a document that we produced a couple of years ago now. We had lots of copies printed, and then COVID struck. The printed copies, when we were going to go out, you know, whenever we go to conferences and meet people and do talks like this, we were meant to take a stack of them and offer them to people. Unfortunately, COVID struck, and so I've got an office full of these books. So if anybody would like a copy, it covers all mammals, their populations, distributions and trends. Please do go onto the Mammal Society website. The address is at the bottom there, and search for State of Mammals in Wales, and you can order a copy, and I'll post one out to you via that. But yeah, so we've got lots of copies there. How are we doing for time? Okay, so another project that we worked on over recent years is trying to focus in on questions that we don't know. So our Rare Woodland Bats project is a partnership project between various groups to try and look for these 3 species. So this is Bechstein at the top, Barbastelle bottom right, and Alcathoe bottom left. So these we term as our rare woodland bats, which we just need to know a lot more about. Generally speaking, for other species, you come across them a lot more in development in buildings, but for these are predominantly or entirely woodland and tree dwelling species, which means that we just don't tend to come across them in development. There's very few surveys that's done on woodlands relative to buildings, so they're dramatically under-recorded, and we're always worried that actually colonies of these rare bats will be lost before we even know where they are. Yeah, we put a lot of effort over the last few years trying to figure out where some of these species are, and lots of modeling work trying to predict where they might occur based on habitats and climate. And then what we tend to do is following that, we pick the sites that we think that where there might be based on modeling, and we deploy detectors such as this one. This is a detector, again, talking about the advances in equipment. This is a waterproof unit that knows when sunset and sunrise is by a GPS, so it just switches itself on and off for the night, and you can program it depending on how you want it to behave, and you can leave it out for weeks at a time gathering data. So these are really valuable instruments in terms of being able to collect data about species instead of having to be there all night every night trying to search. And then we can look at the calls later on a computer, or we can drive transects or walk transects and try and search. So this is the Beta-Sequoid area, which was highlighted as quite a good potential for barbastelle in particular. So you can see this was the efforts of an evening walking and sidling, looking for bats in that area by the bat group. What we're searching for ideally would be this. This is a barbastelle call, so you can see, compared to some of the calls that flashed up before, you can see that these are actually quite distinct shape and pattern and quite unique. So if for certain species we have a very good idea when we get them, so barbastelle. For other species like Bechstein, their calls are very cryptic, and so again, we try and employ trapping to try and catch where we think they might be. So we can go out and catch bats, but again, it's also useful for species that aren't so easy to detect. So even just our relatively common brown long-eared here, these bats are incredibly quiet. They're also known as a whispering bat, and barbastelle are quite similar as well in terms of long-eared and barbastelle have been in a kind of evolutionary arms race with insects. So they both predominantly forage on moths, and because they've been evolving for such a long time as of insects, moths have developed a crude sense of hearing, a tympanic membrane, an auditory organ within their abdomens, which can detect ultrasound coming. So essentially they can hear bats coming. So this is obviously a great advantage if you're predated by something that goes around shouting all night long. So moths can then hear bats coming, they can fold their wings, they can fly the opposite direction. Different moths have evolved different ways of dealing with it. Some have or can click their abdomens and block the sonar, confuse it, and so they have different techniques of avoiding. Some taste nasty, obviously, but some of different techniques of avoiding when they hear a bat coming, avoiding being predated. So then bats then have changed what they do. So in the case of the brown long-eared, essentially they stop going around shouting at the top of their voice, and they start to whisper. And then because they're quieter calls, they then have to have bigger ears to hear the echolocation, but also they can passively listen as well. So some bats can just hang up or fly around, and they can listen for the noise of insects moving on leaf litter or within trees and predate that way. And for other species, again, like this button in the bottom right, this is a whiskered bat. What I was talking about before, in terms of how to identify them, there's this little just at the top of the point of my mouse here. This is a cling on the fourth premolar of a whiskered or Brandt's bat. And what we have to look at is the relative size between that cusp and the P3 tooth in front of it. So really tiny, very fine, like details that can actually be the difference between identifying some of these cryptic species, and they sound just the same. Sometimes you can get a feel for which species it is from calls, but to really determine it, you have to get them in the hand a lot of the time. So yeah, catching is very good for that. Other species such as serotine, again, they're cryptic with some of the big bats, the nocturnal lislers, when they're in cluttered environments. So sometimes catching can be useful. This picture of the barbastelle, which is obviously the one that we're really after and think most likely to be present in North Wales, to the point where we've got enough kind of handfuls of records. This is our recognised distribution, the range of the barbastelle. As you can see, in terms of North Wales, we've got a question mark or a distribution for this area of southern North Wales, and so we've been doing a lot of work there recently, looking at all so this map shows that distribution combined with areas of broadleaf woodland. So we kind of done a lot of work focusing in on particularly this kind of Dolgechlei area where we think that there's a good chance that they are, and there's large amounts of suitable habitat. And with the idea that once we catch them, we can catch them. So this is a barbastelle in a net. This was a project I worked on in Pembrokeshire, where we caught them and radio tracked them to find their roosts. And not only are they within woodlands and hard to find, but they're also within incredibly fragile places. So this is actually a roost, and barbastelles roost behind flaking bark on dead or dying broadleaf trees, and within living features as well, but very regularly just behind flaking bark. And this is extremely prone to being either knocked off, so this was kind of pretty much head height where I could look in, and this is actually a row of pups. So the mum have gone out, and this is a row of pups of barbastelle that I can see inside this roost. So really kind of fragile places that if we don't kind of know where they are and protect, we're very easy to, if woodland work was going on in the area, to knock that bark off and destroy the roost. And if done at the wrong time, would kill numbers of bats. Another project we've been working on lots is looking at this. So I mentioned it before, the rare migratory bat enthusiast, which probably isn't as rare as we thought. This should have updated this, apologies. We've got a few more records on this now, but these green squares are known records for Methusias pipistrelle. As I said before, rare migratory bat that travels in from northern Europe, Latvia, Estonia, Russia. We know these locations from ringing studies. So then we catch them in the autumn and spring, predominantly associated with large water bodies, so go out to large lakes and catch, and you can find these Methusias. So we're trying to understand really what their status is, and there's a large ringing study going on, so we can catch them and see whether they've been rung within Europe or rung in Britain. And a number of recoveries have now happened where they've been rung, and they then track them back to Europe, and we've now beginning to build arrays. So what we can also do is radio track them, and we've now, particularly around the coast of Norfolk, and with partners in the Netherlands, we've got arrays of radio tracking receivers, and these are beginning to pick up their movements and how they're crossing the sea and migrating that way. So amazing for such a small animal that they're making movements of several thousand kilometers in just a couple of weeks. So this little diagram on the right is really our was plans that we were coming up with on where bats might move in. So we think that there's a good chance that they're moving up the North Wales coast. We've got colleagues in South Lancs, Cheshire, who are catching them quite regularly, and we know that there's big populations on island that are actually resident. Quite why they're resident there and nowhere else, it's almost like they've kind of migrated too far, hit island, and then can't go any further, otherwise they end up in the sea, or America. But yeah, so most of those will end up in the sea, so they stick in island perhaps. We don't really understand that, but we're trying to figure out what's happening in terms of movement backwards and forwards between island. So we've got static arrays of detectors, solar powered, that stay out all season long on places like Bardsey, Grasholm, Stockholm, Ramsey, trying to pick up movements of bats going backwards and forwards across the Irish Sea, which is proving some good results, particularly in the south, but also in north, where we've been setting equipment here as well to record them and to catch. And Trouse is one of our study sites as well, so you can see Trouse in the background, and they very kindly provided us with some new types of lures and equipment to help us do it. But all these kind of events we try to run as educational for volunteers, and try to kind of train people on bats and enthuse people about bats. So I'm nearly there, but where it's going to kind of go is, as you can see from hopefully what I've been saying, bats are an incredibly complex group of animals, and live in huge numbers of places, and that makes them extremely challenging to protect. So bats can be impacted by a huge number of things, building works included. So because they can roost in such a lot of different places in buildings, from re-roofing to demolitions to renovations, tree works, even pointing of stonework in buildings, they can all have impacts via losing roosting sites for bats. And the danger with this is, so a lot of people say, well, why are bats still quite so heavily protected? Every time you go out, I'll see them around the lamppost, I'll see them in the garden. I don't often see an otter. I've never seen an otter, so maybe I can understand why that's not protected. But I see bats every night, so why are they still protected? And it goes back to what I was saying before about how slow they are to breed. So they can be impacted in huge numbers of ways by building works. And let's say this building that's being demolished here had a roost of 100 bats in. Well, if females only have one pup a year, if you demolish that and kill a large number of bats by knocking that down, or they lose their roost, and that's the only roost that they've got in the area, and therefore you're impacting them. It can take a long time when you're so slow breeding to keep to build your population back up and to maintain a robust population. While as again with mice and rats, for example, you can try and exterminate them as hard as you like. They breed in such numbers and with such speed that it's very impossible to impact on their overall kind of population status. While as for bats, it's very easy. So that's why it remains quite so they remain quite so protected. But other impacts on bats, we see medication of animals, using ivermectins particularly, have had big negative impacts on species such as greater horseshoe, but all species really that rely on insects and farmland, but particularly horseshoe bats. There's a very good kind of case study, an example of where ivermectins have impacted on greater horseshoes. So greater horseshoe predominantly forage over grazed open areas. They use woodland at other times, but they eat a lot of dung beetles and dung flies. And so if our cattle are medicated, our animals are medicated, it essentially sterilizes the dung, and therefore your insect levels are a lot lower. So where ivermectins have been stopped being used close to roosts and areas that we know are foraged on by greater horseshoes, we see a positive increase in terms of their numbers. But use of pesticides and generally decreasing numbers of invertebrates, which we're seeing across kind of species of inverts, is incredibly negative for all sorts of different organisms, the organisms themselves, but also anything that predates them. Bats. Loss of hedgerows and changes in forestry and development, roads and lighting, kind of splitting our landscape, are all very negative impacts on bats, and something that we try to work to control and to mitigate. Roads can form physical barriers. They can form barriers via the light, but also, they can also form hazards to this. So bats, again, lesser horseshoes are a really good example. Fly along predominantly at knee height, which is bumper height, and so we do know that a lot of lesser horseshoes do get killed on roads. So we try and put a lot of effort when we're designing new roads to make sure that if we're near roosts or we're on flight lines of roosts from roosts, that appropriate mitigation is put in. And predominantly that's these days, what we've learned really works is under road mitigation, so culverts that are big enough for them to fly through. What we do know is that again, if you go to Glencleave, and you'll see them around the country now, there's kind of wire gantries called bat bridges, where people have tried to lead bats over the top. So if you're cutting through a hedgerow where normally bats would be coming across A to B, people have tried to put kind of wire bridges over the top, and unfortunately they don't really seem to work very well at all. But what we do know works is culverts. But to put a culvert in once a road is built is very, very difficult. If we can design it in whilst they're being built, then it's much cheaper and easier. So these kind of sticking plasters like the bridges that we try and put on don't work half as well as the underpasses. So sensible design is always useful. And then really just wrapping up now, but the point is that actually we can all help bats. As I said earlier on, bats are pretty simple things. All they really need is somewhere to live and something to eat. So the more insects we can draw into gardens and insect friendly plants, ponds, wetlands, night scented plant species such as honeysuckle are incredibly positive for insects. So we can draw those in, then bats will benefit from those. And again, boxes, we can make boxes very cheaply and easily off offcuts. There are designs available, particularly this top left one. If you Google Kent bat box, they're very easy and cheap to make, and bats really like those. Or you can buy kind of commercially available ones such as the bottom left, and this is called a Schwegler bat box, and it's woodcrete. So it's a combination of concrete and wood shavings and wood dust, which gives it really good thermal properties and very good uptake of these by bats. And yeah, very last slide is really to say, well, people say, well, okay, some people believe in the intrinsic value of wildlife and nature, and other people need a little bit more help. So this is a bad example because of what's happened, but a good example in terms of why bats, what do bats do for us? Well, in terms of ecosystem services, they are nature's pest control. And we shouldn't really judge a species on how well it eats another species, because I like insects as well. But a pipistrelle will eat 3,000 midges in an evening. So they really do kind of control pests or I shouldn't say pests, reduce, predate large numbers of insects. And this has really been seen in America, where unfortunately there is a disease that's wiping through American bat populations, and it's killed millions and millions and millions and millions of bats. And it's called white nose syndrome, and it's caused by a fungus, Pseudogeomyces destructans, which is a weird cold-loving fungus, and it's found its way probably from Europe with humans into American caves, and the bats in Europe seemingly have evolved to be used to this fungus. But in America, where the bats aren't used to it, the fungus has found its way into the caves and has moved through the caves across the whole of America now, or all of Northern America, and into Canada as well. And what it does is it grows on the bats, and it irritates them, disturbs them out of hibernation to the point where actually they just starve to death. So millions of bats have died through starvation through this fungus that's been growing on them, and it's called white nose syndrome because the fungus kind of a classic symptom is a white nose from where the fungus grows on their nose. And what the result of that is obviously a terrible loss of bat populations, so terrible for a conservation point of view. But what's really made actually politicians stand up and take notice of this is the with the loss of those bats is a reduction in insects have eaten off farms. So it's been calculated that best about 23 billion pounds a year in the USA. The loss of bats has been cost because they're having to put on so much more pesticide and use other methods of trying to control pests, which the bats previously did for free. So now we're seeing it in large amounts of area, that they're putting up, doing their absolute best. Farmers are trying to reduce their costs by trying to attract bats in. So this is an example of a pretty amazing bat house that has been purpose built within a farming area to try and draw bats in to help them control the pests on their crops. And I think probably that you're on mute, Mark. Can't hear you. I have seen some things come up in the chat. I can try and find the chat, and while Mark tries to get his volume back on, I'll see if there's some questions in the chat that I can answer. So first question: are flying fox fruit